I'm sorry that I went away on sabbatical to France, because I think that that's when this decision was made to give me the rather formidable task of summing up the conference, of providing a resume. I thought I'd start with a concept that Philippe Gervais-Lambourny introduced us to, the Tomason. Pardon?
No, he's just starting.
Oh, okay. Philippe Gervais-Lambourny spoke about the Tomason as the relic of something that we might find lying around a city that we wouldn't necessarily understand. We might not know what it belonged to, what it was part of, what it was for. And here's my example of a Tomason. This is a pink bicycle that I saw at the bottom of the Ari River, which runs through Bern in Switzerland. And you could make up a very poignant story about this bicycle. It is obviously someone's ex-beloved pink bicycle that somehow got to the bottom of the river. We don't know exactly what the story is, so perhaps it's a Tomason. And I think there used to be the idea that we could very much just harvest these Tomasons, just gather them, pick them up, put them all together. And I think that that idea has still been running through this conference a little bit. I think it was evident in the first paper about the Lubumbashi project when that paper spoke about filling in the gaps and writing a counter-narrative to the colonial history. That's very much the idea that you find little bits and pieces and you gather them up and make a new history. But then I think there were also more complex ideas of memory presented in the course of the conference. And here I want to ask, do memories have addresses? Now, I noticed that when you might remember Maurice Smithers talking about Yeoville and reminiscing about Yeoville, and since I lived there in the 80s, I was particularly affected by that, and I felt tears of nostalgia come to my eyes, which I want to tell you that Maurice Smithers is going to take advantage of, because he's going to squeeze me for 200 Rand a month now for Yeoville. But later when I was talking to him, I was amazed by his absolutely detailed memory. So he would say, oh yes, Barbara, she lived at 23 Hunter Street. That was before she moved to 32 Yeoville Street. And Peter, oh yes, he lived at 17 Fortescue. And it was incredible. And then I realized that that is one of the organizing mechanisms of his memory. I could almost hear the click as if it was a card dropping into one of those old-fashioned catalog boxes, you know, that you would have in a library or an archive. And I realized that that's Maurice's way of archiving his memories, one of the ways. And that takes us back to what Philippe Gervais-Lambourny was saying about the different ways that memories can be evoked, solicited, or even manufactured. And you might remember that he had that delightful image of Proust, who I am imagining with a Madeleine in one hand, maybe he's taken a bite out of it, meeting up with Lefebvre. So those two ways of thinking about memories. One that is occasioned by an almost violent assault on the senses, the smell of the Madeleine, and the other that is manufactured, deliberately produced. Right, so memories. Do they have addresses? I think one of the other important ideas that was introduced into this conference was that slums are also part of the city, but official memory doesn't always want to make allowances for that. So Quentin had that wonderful image from Kisumu, where he talked about the boda cyclist who said that he wasn't welcome in the center of the city which was being consecrated towards the official memory of Kisumu as glorious and modern. And the quotation that Quentin used was wonderful. It was about that the Boda Boda cyclist talked about how they weren't allowed to bring the dust of the slums with them. And I thought that was a very evocative and powerful image. And so that makes me pose this question about how far do we need to, can we afford to, are we allowed to integrate into the city? And we had various people talking on that theme. I think Eric spoke very interestingly about Yoruba people and how cautiously they often had to negotiate their identity, wanting to express a certain kind of ethnic identity, but also being rightly afraid and having to be very careful about how they came into the city and how they expressed their identity. So again, do memories need an address? So Celine spoke to us about the so-called furnished hotels in Paris and asked the question about those people who take out leases on the hotels, who are far from home. Can they develop any feelings of attachment, especially under living conditions which are really far from ideal? And I think that glimpse that we had in one of her slides of potted plants on the windowsill suggested that people can develop feelings of attachment even under those conditions. And that, I think, was what a large part of their stories were about their creation of networks and their feelings of attachment. But they were also about how people remember their origins. That came across in Ludovic's paper as well. And they raise questions for us about what is home. I've just been away in Europe and Latin America for the last year, and I remember finding it very strange to be saying to people, I'm going home, because in the end, I had about 10 different homes. I had no idea what my home was. So to think about all these different associations that we have with home, and it was pointed out that our associations with home are not always pleasant. Sometimes home is a place of repression and violence. Eric spoke about how people develop affinity for the buildings we see going up before our eyes, and he was talking about particularly the stadium built in the 1950s in Mbare. And that's very interesting. Then that raises the corollary. What happens when the buildings go, when they close down? That's like the furnished hotels in Paris too. What happens when they close down? Do the memories close down with them? And then that takes us forward to Frédéric and Marie-Hélène's paper when they asked, can there be memories if there are no material remains? And I'm guessing that that will be a question that we'll ask tomorrow too when we go to visit Sophiatown, in which there are very few material traces of that place's history. Then I found this a very interesting minor discussion, which perhaps you might have forgotten. I think it was raised by Annie, because the English speakers here talked about heritage, and Chaya talked about heritageization. That's a hard one, and worse in French. I'm not going to attempt it. But that made me think about what, and Annie said she didn't want to use the word heritage. She preferred patrimoine. And I thought, I wonder, that's very interesting. I wonder if there's a real distinction between the meanings of heritage and patrimoine, more than one being in English and the other in French. So what are the associations with heritage? And I know that they're very problematic. A lot of Americans, for example, find the use of heritage suggests something frivolous. Heritage is a hobby, often very conservative. And a very limiting word, and I think that came out in some of the presentations as well, that sometimes when something is declared as heritage, it means that it has to be old in a very limited kind of sometimes contrived sense. It has to be traditional, again, often artificially traditional. Fred and Marie-Hélène talked about heritage being reduced to remarkable buildings or taking us down the carefully paved path. Heritage, or declaring places as heritage sites, often means keeping the undesirables out. That came across in Anna's paper about Cairo and in others as well. So we can allow cyclists. Pauline told us about the cycle tours that are offered around the Vilakazi precinct in Soweto, but we can't have the border cyclists, okay, from Kenya. Paradoxically, often when we're talking about heritage, what the real interests are modernization and redevelopment. And then people have to strategize to think about how they can get a piece of that modernization through playing the heritage instrument. And Quentin's paper was very good on that as well. Okay, and then patrimoine. Well, French speakers, you must tell me what you think, if there is really a different resonance to the word patrimoine. So here I've thrown out some provocative questions. Is patrimoine a different concept from heritage? Does it speak more of some kind of intimacy, some kind of more real connection? It contains in it the word for country. Is that significant? Is patrimoine more serious than heritage? Is it less open to manipulation? And here you'll see I've used a slide of a monument to the dead of the First and Second World Wars, which is very, very common all around villages in France. Then we come to the role of history and the role of the historian. And Annie boldly pointed out to us that history is not the same as memory. I think often we hope to fudge it. We hope not to have to address this very difficult distinction. And really what she asked us to think about through her own role in Paris is what happens to those of us who try to do both, who try to be historians, true to our métier, and public historians. Sometimes the demands are conflicting. What are the implications if history is about deconstruction, always seeking out the deeper meanings, always looking for further evidence, always trying to locate the episode or the event or the personality in a wider and more complex context? If history is about restoring temporality, restoring a strict sense of chronology and periodization. So what does history do? Does it recall us to reality? Does it sober us up? Does it remind us, as Annie Foucault said, that Napoleon III, well, how can we be celebrating him? He was a tyrant. So history feels very strict. But I think the suggestion was also that history can call up possibilities. It can save us from the weight of what Alan called the grand narrative. And what Alan and other speakers asked us to think about, I think also Fred and Marie-Hélène, is can we, and if we can, how do we insert different histories in public places? Pauline also asked this question. And then using Alan's phrase, can we afford to make way for the uncivil society, the people who are going to cause trouble, the people who are going to dissent from the official version? And Alan asked us to consider whether if we allow for more complex pasts, it will enable us to think better and in a more complex way about the future. And then there's the question of terrible memories. Well, in Philippe's keynote address, he referred us back to Jacob Dlamini's native nostalgia and the idea that it may be possible to have pleasant, amusing memories that were actually located in terrible times. And Philippe showed us those pictures of Comet and talked about how people going back there were filled with nostalgia. They recognized the limitations and the deprivations of living in that place, but at the same time, they recognized it as a place of relative security and safety. And they said to Philippe, if you want to understand how we got where we are, to a particular position in the municipal council, for example, then you have to see this place. Okay. But what about terrible memories? And I think, again, this came out in Fred and Marie-Hélène's paper. What about the memories of atrocity, genocide, terror, that jar with the idea of the happy nation? So here we see demonstrators in October last year demonstrating for and asking, demanding for that massacre of Algerian protesters in 1961 to be officially commemorated. And it was asked, how do people get their memories heard and recognized? And one of the demands of this group of people that I found to be really very interesting was the demand for what they said. And I had never heard this phrase outside of an academic text. It's the demand for a lieu de mémoire. Then I'll just go through this quickly, but we had very stimulating other ways of thinking and remembering the city presented to us at the end. So we had Tasneem's idea of the carnival cartography, the way that the minstrels redraw boundaries, and there's always that risk of official displeasure. This picture actually comes from Switzerland, but it's the same idea as the Cape Carnival. It's that idea of risking displeasure, making fun of people in power, subversion, transgressing boundaries, and recalling a history of transgression. Then we had the idea of the vernacular photograph as opposed to the iconic photograph from Sophie. And I was struck by the phrase that she used, that sometimes in these photographs you can see an adaptation to the new architecture. In this picture, which comes from the South End location in Port Elizabeth, you can see evidence of nostalgia for the old. And Sophie reminded us that these pictures often don't fit with the narrative of trauma. So it's that making the grand narrative complex, difficult, and ambivalent again. And that's also an image from the South End Museum in Port Elizabeth. Sophie talked about how with vernacular photography there is that need. We have to grasp the detail and the ordinary. This museum is very much about how people made their home in this area. And a question was raised at the back there about, but doesn't photography, or don't these images actually have rather an uncomfortable relationship with the colonial project? And that I think we could probe productively. And conclusions, just very quickly. So we've been trying to think about the relationship between cities and memories in the plural. We've thought about memories that are native to the city and those that are not, and what the implications of that are. We've thought about cities changing, and Philippe asked us to remember that that's the nature of cities, and what does that do to memory as a consequence. And what we haven't dealt with very satisfactorily is issues of gender, and not just gender as a synonym for women, but gender as a way of seeing and a way of representation. And right at the end, Sophie talked about naughty ladies, the photographs of the naughty ladies, and that made me realize that we haven't talked about sexuality at all. Nothing about sexuality and the city. Then we've talked about heritage, and I've tried to provoke you into thinking about whether there are distinctions between the word heritage in English and patrimoine in French. and just remembering that they serve particular interests, they create particular spin-offs for certain people. I think this was Fred's phrase, does modernity have a memory? And how do we make space for more memories, but not just for more memories, but for ones that can be profoundly dissident? Thanks.